a real treat. And really, the tagline to this talk could be everything you have learned to think about the climate crisis is probably wrong. But not wrong like completely wrong, but wrong in a narrow, fragmented, and sometimes deeply misleading way. No example of this is more clear these days than the Anthropocene concept, the so called age of man, and the notion of anthropogenic climate crisis, that is, climate crisis made by humanity instead of those actually responsible, that is, corporations, bankers, armies, political establishments, and so on and so forth. The people who are responsible for the climate crisis have names and addresses and bank accounts. As climate denialism has essentially collapsed in the Atlantic world as a popular force, if you look at the data for the U.S., once the bastion of climate denialism, it's gone from mid to high 20s a decade ago to, according to the Pew Research outfit, about 15%, nearly all of whom are over 65. No ageism here, simply there's a massive generational shift that has made the old style climate denialism a spent political force. That's very, very clear. However, I like to ask, is it any more denial? Is it any less denialism to refuse to identify the key forces and the key agents behind the climate crisis? And what that kind of soft denialism does, trumpeted in the pages of The Guardian and the nonprofit eco-industrial establishment and practically everywhere else, well, it's humanity as a whole that's a problem, it's fossil fuels that are a problem. This is a dynamic of cleansing the actual causal forces behind the climate crisis, cleansing them of their relations of capital, class, and empire, amongst others. And engaged in this, as part of this massive reframing, we see two key moves. We could identify more, but I think these are crucial. One is to reframe the crisis as a so called climate emergency and therefore to advocate openly for state of emergency rule. And it's instructive to note that state of emergency rule has never been good, never been about actual emergencies. This is a long history of essentially creeping and sometimes galloping authoritarianism used to impose restrictions on civil liberties and empower the top 1 or 0.1%, as the case may be. This is the history, for instance, of neoliberal shock doctrines in Latin America, as Naomi Klein gave us. This is the history of presidential emergency rule, which has now become rule under permanent emergency in the United States. And then, so this is that's one part of it, to declare an emergency and then advocate for emergency politics, which always means more authoritarianism and less democracy. An argument advocated by the eco-industrial establishment, including one of the authors, Jorgen Randers, of the original Limits to Growth report. You can look at the 2012 report commissioned by the Club of Rome on this question. We need less democracy. He's straight up about this, as if we have so much democracy in an era when democracy over the past 50 years has been radically compromised across the world, not least in places like the United States. You have people saying, well, we need even less popular rule than what existed before, which was never very much, of course. And then, of course, there's the ongoing reframing of the latest Malthusian moment that is really an inheritance from Spaceship Earth environmentalism, but has a much longer history, going back indeed to Locke and Descartes, even before Malthus. But this is to redefine the problem through what I call the eternal conflict of man and nature. Now, here's the thing. Man and nature don't have any, and I use the deliberately antiquated form because they don't really have anything to do necessarily with either man or nature, and they have everything to do with relations of class power and imperial rule. And again, from second wave environmentalism onwards, although again, it has a much longer history, from second wave environmentalism onwards, from Paul Ehrlich and the first Earth Day, the effort was always to hold human nature responsible and to identify humanity as a whole as the driver of pollution and, of course, today, climate crisis, to redefine obviously capitalogenic, that is made by capital, capitalogenic environmental problems as made by humans. And of course, humanity is not an actor. Armies are actors, churches are actors, universities can be actors, classes are actors, political parties. You get the idea that humanity as a whole does nothing. And this is, in fact, an invention of the post 1492 era, and this eternal conflict of man versus nature was part of the cosmological architecture, the mode of thought of capitalism, if you will, from its earliest moments. And you can go back to John Locke and Rene Descartes, and even before that, the Iberian metaphysical instrumentalists, people like Francisco de Vitoria, who was kind of, Descartes before Descartes. This is deeply sort of hardwired into the software, if you will, to mix my metaphors of capitalist modernity and to identify problems as man versus nature. This has real political implications dating back all the way to the 17th century because it tends to reduce political problems to managerial problems that will be fixed by administrative and technocratic and means and under the tutelage of good science. In an emphatically sarcastic way. And this is very evident in the Anthropocene's trajectories. If you've seen some version of this, as I'm guessing many of you had, given your interest in these topics, this is a set of empirical accounts that have no agents behind them. They're not actually tracing the causal mechanisms and the institutional, political, economic drivers of this so-called great acceleration. And so what we are looking at as an alternative is to really examine these dynamics historically. And once you get into the weeds historically, we can only do a little bit here, the reality begins to look much different. This is not about denying the geophysical severity of the present climate crisis. It is indeed a climate crisis, and it is driven by capitalogenic forcing. This is empirically clear, although many scientists and others persist in misidentifying the problem. The way that it's been misidentified, and this goes back not just to the limits to growth model, and before that, the World 2 model from Jay Forrester, and indeed from the ways that cybernetics developed after World War II. This is cannot be the climate crisis cannot ultimately be made sense of through these concept indicator concepts and slogans that tend to reduce the problem to economic growth, consumption, population, pollution. Those representations aren't empirically flawed in all cases, sometimes misleading, but they are used in interpretively dangerous ways to support the politics of planetary management. Indeed, this is very much emanating from the most elite sections of the eco-industrial complex today. Top universities, top NGOs, Davos, Bilderberg, all of these, they're very aggressively endorsing a climate austerity and technofix solution to the climate emergency. And so what we want to do to begin to make sense, I'm not going to say that I have all the answers here, but if we want to make sense of what is genuinely new about the present conjuncture, we also need to situate it within its long-term, large-scale patterns of development. So we're going to go to a very crude and elementary framework here of what I call the climate class conjuncture. This gives us a much, much better way of understanding unfavorable climate shifts across the past 2,000, even 3,000 years, and the kinds of civilizational crises that have ensued. Why is climate so important? Well, and again, a very crude and reductionist way, and of course the story is much more elaborate and complex than this allows. bad climate has negative impacts on agriculture, which has negative impacts on surplus labor. So historically, favorable climates, and this is especially true for the Western European zone, favorable climates are climates that are favorable to agriculture, and they provide both motive and opportunity for ruling classes to reestablish relations of exploiter and exploited. A classic instance of this is, if you remember your medieval history, Charlemagne and the Carolingian efflorescence, pardon me, the Carolingian Renaissance, where virtually every campaigning season in Charlemagne's life, he could go, had favorable weather, which allowed him to go out and conquer, but also it was profitable because there was an agricultural revolution that capitalized on the thawing of the Dark Ages cold period right around the year 700, a little bit earlier even, but especially in the moment of Carolingian Renaissance. The same thing for the High Middle Ages, for the Middle Ages of knights and cathedrals and castles, that very much depended upon the favorable climatic shift of the medieval climate anomaly, sometimes called the medieval warm period. It was warm in Europe, so that's why we call it that. And what this means is that how civilizations respond to climate changes is very different according to the character of surplus labor and the relation of exploited and exploiter. We can go into this. This doesn't mean everything is socially constructed, emphatically not. It means that dialectical changes, as Marx and Engels saw in agriculture, urbanization, commerce, military revolutions, all of that, operate within non-dialectical processes of what I call the web of life, because nature is a very dangerous word and a very misleading word. But non-dialectical events in the web of life. There are volcanic eruptions which have a gigantic impact on the history of not just pre-capitalist formations, but also in the history of capitalism. As we'll see, solar fluctuations, orbital variations, these all have profound impacts on the climate, but those profound impacts are extremely variable according to geography and social relations. Social relations are, of course, geographical. And that means that instead of this very vague and neo-Malthusian and civilizing project notion of man against nature, the eternal conflict, we understand that that framing is itself a product of the very forces that have created capitalogenic climate crisis today. So that's kind of the broad overview. A lot of these lines here, and I'll go through a lot of slides here, probably too fast, but I would just want to expose you to a very, very brief introduction to a vast universe that might be an alternative worth considering, especially because it gives us a different way of understanding the history. First of all, these supposedly scientific notions and man versus nature and all of this, these are not just epistemological structures, they are politics. And this is very, very explicit in the politics, going all the way back to the Trilateral Commission, the Club of Rome, which of course grows out of the OECD, and other outfits in the early 1970s. They were quite explicit about this, that the environmental crisis, so-called, mandated forms of planetary management. In fact, that's a phrase directly lifted from one of the organizers of Stockholm's 72 conference, Richard Gardner, a US diplomat and trilateralist. Let's replace that with a more nuanced notion of how class structure and class struggles operate within the web of life. This means something far more than a crude and reductionist vulgar Marxism, which is, by the way, often correct anyway, but this is not that. It says that what matters are the relations of surplus labor and how those are organized. That is intimately a metabolic process. Thus, all class relations are metabolic relations, and that shapes the contours of social life beyond agriculture, states and religions and wars and all the rest, all that fun stuff. And this means that we are equipped with a way to make specific assessments of how civilizations enter into crises under definite climate conditions. Now, historically, by and large, these have been climate changes the result of natural forcing. However, we'll see some interesting exceptions to that even before the present moment. And this gives us a crucial way to understand the limits to capitalism, or if you prefer, the limits to growth, that are not the kind of Malthus with a computer approach of Meadows and her team and Jay Forrester before them. So, Anthropocene, do we live in the age of man? This is, of course, the drumbeat of the media, academic, eco-industrial complex to convince us, well, we're all at fault. The older, cruder overpopulationism of people like Paul Ehrlich, which has been thoroughly discredited on empirical as well as sort of ethno-supremacist grounds, that this is that has was overpopulation was rebranded as overconsumption. There are lots of problems with that, and if you're curious, you can push me on that in the Q&A. But what I've argued for now about 15 years is this is really a provocation to, we live in the age of man, the problems are anthropogenic. No, they're not. If there's any scene that we live in, this is, of course, a kind of mocking response to the Anthropocene. We live in the Capitalocene. But really, we still live in the Holocene, which, when it was formulated at the end of the 19th century, contained everything that Crutzen and Sturmer talked about when they first advanced the Anthropocene as a notion. And you can go and look at, especially Crutzen and Steffen's work, that it's totally techno-determinist. It says the origins and the drivers of modern climate crisis are population and the steam engine. This is empirically false. The steam engine itself is a dependent variable of the great plantation revolutions that then set the stage for industrialization. We know empirically that we live in a world of capitalogenic, made by capitalogenic climate change. This is incontestable in any empirical grounds. This is one of many potential illustrations that I could give you. I've written at great length about this. These illustrations come out of the work of the so-called Carbon Majors Project. You can go look at them and dissect that evidence. I think it actually overstates the number of corporations today that are directly involved in capitalogenic climate change, because they do not include, for instance, the great so-called passive index firms of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard that are the largest shareholders, just for example, in about 90% of the US top 500 corporations. So the level of centralization and concentration of capital is even greater. I'm not going to do a deep dive in here, but I just want to remind everyone that the invention of man and nature in their modern senses was very much an outcome of the rise of capitalism, the Colombian invasions, and the genocides of the New World, which were directly the result, on the scale that we saw, 95% of the population, a result of slave raiding. They were they were a labor recruitment project that went terribly, terribly, terribly wrong, and has had all sorts of impacts on the climate as well. So there are scholars like Lewis and Maslin who talk about the 16th century origins of the so-called Anthropocene. What I would really like to highlight is that our imaginations of climate crisis and its causes are profoundly fractured. And they're profoundly fractured around what you can call the human and natural sciences, or what you might call, after C.P. Snow, the two cultures. And so we have a zillion different versions of this kind of chart. This is from one of the IPCC's scenarios over the past decade. We all know this. We all have this. Oh, there's more carbon than ever in the atmosphere. That's very, very significant, and indeed a fundamental part of a climate crisis. But then, for the most part, there's a complete illiteracy and ignorance of the dynamics of capital and capital accumulation. This is not the only example of this, but basically, over the past century, capitalism has sunk deeper and deeper and deeper into stagnation, with notable exceptions, the post-war expansion being a key one. And you can see this is a cyclical phenomenon Today, it's entirely questionable whether capitalism, in any meaningful sense, survives, since capitalism relies on competition, and in no major economic sector in the world do we have very much competition. Everything's dominated by 3, 4, or 5 corporations. But my point is that we don't put these together. And this is crucial. This is one way of representing climate class conjunctures. Here is the long-term agricultural productivity slowdown since the era of the Green Revolution, despite multiple announcements of a new Green Revolution. Biotech was going to save the world. None of it's revived agricultural productivity growth. A great paper by Ortiz Bobea and her colleagues, including the great agronomists Lobel and Fields, identified fully 7 years of agricultural productivity loss owing to climate change alone. And there are many other factors that are pushing downwards agricultural productivity growth. I've written on this at some length, and of course, these are very, very compressed snippets of very, very complex histories. And what does this mean? It means when we think through climate crises, we need to think through them as two moments, one dynamic, a crisis of life making today and a crisis of profit making. These are two sides of the same dynamic. These are linked, for instance, to the now simmering phony war phase of World War III, where the U.S. is trying to destabilize China and Belt and Road, which is probably not going to get very far. But that is very much a climate phenomenon as well. We need to have an imaginary in which climate is not a deus ex machina coming in, that climate is part of everything. It's just not everything. It's what I call here in a slide or two a contradiction multiplier. And so what we want to be able to do is to ask very astute, historically grounded questions that allow us to understand what kind of crisis capitalism is in today. And there are basically two choices, as there would be for any civilization. Is it a developmental crisis that can be resolved, or is it an epochal crisis? My vote goes for door number 2. And to make a long story short, the frontiers of fixing capitalism are now gone. And the waste frontiers that were a free ride for pollution, including greenhouse gases, those are now gone. So this Ortiz Bobea study that I mentioned from the journal Nature Climate Change in 2021 about the suppression of agricultural productivity isn't a harbinger of famine, but a harbinger of a crisis of surplus labor under capitalism, because all surplus labor in any class society comes out of agricultural productivity. So we need to begin to ask these longer, deeper historical questions. And I'm just going to make sure that I don't go too far off the rails with time here. So here's one big takeaway, and this I'm going to skip over some slides in the interest of time, but really dwell on some of these. First of all, unfavorable climate shifts over the past 2,000 to 3,000 years have been bad for ruling classes, and that is, all things being equal, good for everyone who works for a living. It's bad for the exploiters. It's good for the exploited. There's an older Dark Ages narrative that has been totally debunked, for instance, by scholars of late antiquity and early medieval Europe. We now understand that there was a great golden age that followed the demise of Western Roman power. Peasants occupied the villas and repurposed them. Archaeologists tell us that the peasants who reestablished a kind of peasant mode of production lived healthier. Women and men lived more equitably, which means they reasonably and fairly rapidly adjusted birth rates. It wasn't a great die-off, as was long suspected. The population decline was gradual in these centuries following 450 and the onset of the Dark Ages cold period. There's a lot of information here, and you're not going to be held responsible for this. Don't worry. Here's the takeaway. We're going to encounter this several times. Here's the takeaway. Moments of unfavorable climate shift, here represented by John Brook from his wonderful book. John Brook's 2 climate proxies. One is on the bottom is volcanic activity. The other is solar maxima and minima. And for the climate geeks out there like me, there's a whole debate over the precise ways that solar maxima and minima impact climate. We can get into that, but for this purpose, we know that these eras are moments of you can see these moments of crisis and these moments of expansion are moments of, to put it very crudely, good climate, favorable climate, and bad climate, unfavorable climate. It looks different in different parts of the world, and these instances, these annotations are largely drawn from the Atlantic world. It looks different if you go to sub-Saharan Africa. For instance, terrible cold in the 17th century in Europe was linked to cycles of drought in the Angola, Congo region. And that was quite significant because it related to the slave trade. So here's long story short of this little chart and annotation is when the climate is good, there are opportunities for ruling classes to build new class societies and new civilizations. The Romans, for instance, their whole climate era is called by climate scientists the Roman climate optimum. All right, so that gives you a sense of just how synced up climate and the rise of the Roman Republic and then its imperialist expansion in between roughly 300 BCE and 300 AD really were. Now, there were, of course, variations within that period, and there are other reasons why Rome flourished. But the fact that climate allowed for vineyards, olives to be grown in northern France in the first century AD, that was a boon to the agricultural model that the Romans had incubated. What's concealed and obscured, I think, with dire political implications today in the climate doomist mania of our moment, is that the fact that unfavorable climate shifts, yes, have been very problematic to say the least, and very, very difficult for the producing classes, but also moments of profound crisis for ruling classes because climate supercharges existing class agroecological contradictions, all of these that open up political possibilities for what Walt Scheidel, no radical, by the way, what Walt Scheidel calls the Great Leveling. And he says a simple thing. Look, no great leveling has ever occurred without prodigious violence. It's not because peasants and workers love violence. It's because ruling classes love violence and they want to keep hold of their wealth and power. So draw your inferences to the Washington, NATO sort of war machine these days, if you like. So this is a recurrent dynamic. There might be some of you saying, yes, but today's climate change is different. No doubt. Today's moment of climate crisis is indeed very distinctive, not least because it's a warming crisis and it is capital-ogenic. So there are different contradictions in play. Now, what I'm going to do here is sort of shorthand a few elements of the more recent, that is, over the past five centuries, and then we'll go back even further for a whirlwind tour. So first of all, today's climate crisis is not the first one that is caused by capitalogenic dynamics. That was the long, cold 17th century of climate crisis, of the Little Ice Age. It was the coldest period of the past 8,000 years. It was mostly the result of natural forcing, a shift in the North Atlantic Oscillation and volcanic activity in 601, a Peruvian volcano, Hanapatina, whose name I'm surely butchering, erupts. But the added wrinkle to this was the slaving-induced genocides of the New World, the destruction of 95% of the population. That meant soils were left undisturbed, forests grew back, and you had what Lewis and Maslin call the Orbis, or global Orbis spike, of a decline of about 7 parts CO2 per million in the atmosphere. And that was enough to make this period the coldest period over the past 8,000 years. It was a period, if any of you know this part, a period of history, a period of popular revolt, of political civil wars like the Fronde in France, the English Civil War. It was a period of economic volatility, but this was also the era of the formation of the great productivist colonial empires, unlike any empire the world had ever seen. Above all, the great sugar planting frontiers of northeastern Brazil, and then the silver mining centers of colonial Peru, centered in Potosi. It was also the era that marked the really the consolidation of capitalism as we know it. People think it's the Industrial Revolution because the victors write the textbooks, and the English thought that they were the center of the universe. They were not. This is the moment of the formation of a climate class divide through forms of modern sexism and racism. It's the era of the dawn and early expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. It's the era of a uh, thoroughly violent and predatory gendered counter-revolution within Western Europe to ensure that women were subordinated in the interest of birthing a new proletariat, which indeed did emerge after that. And this was clearly not a problem of man and nature. It was clearly not a problem of overpopulation. It was a dynamic of climate and class, as ever, with empire as the midwife. So there's the Holocene, as I mentioned, contains all the elements that were later updated and rebranded and repackaged into the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, as I know many of you in this audience would readily recognize, is basically Spaceship Earth environmentalism, just repackaged with a few of the particulars changed around. It relies heavily on, for instance, Paul Ehrlich's The Human Enterprise. It goes back to Bucky Fuller was an interesting guy. I'm not bagging on him, but Spaceship Earth environmentalism fit very, very squarely within the elite environmentalism of the time. And what we are probably seeing is the end of the Holocene in the present moment. And it remains to be seen, though, what that's going to look like. Even James, I just want to foreground that this is extremely serious, but even James Hansen later backtracked his Venus syndrome prognosis that there's going to be runaway climate change and we were all going to be baked alive. And Hansen came out just a few years after his 2009 Storms of My Grandfather's book and said, look, that was over exaggerated. It would require all the fossil fuels being dug up. And as we know today, all the fossil fuels are not being dug up. China, for instance, is hitting peak fossil fuel consumption and peak CO2 emission any day now, if it has not already. Even Goldman Sachs says peak fossil fuel consumption at the latest will be hit in the mid 2030s. That's still a very severe problem, but no, indeed, not all the fossil fuel, not all the potential oil, gas, and coal is going to be dug up, which would be the requirement for the so-called Venus syndrome. So Holocene was a 19th century invention that already understood human activity as part of the history of this geological era. It's very unusual, as I'm sure some of you know, to name an interglacial period. And the reason why this has been such a prodigious interglacial period from the standpoint of the human experience and the development of social complexity and class society is, as Ruddiman announced about 2 decades ago, that agriculture stabilized the climate, not just agriculture in itself, but there were many spin-off effects, including stock raising and forest clearance, etc., that stabilized the present interglacial period. Let's see if we can have a nice slide to that effect. This is itself a surplus labor dynamic. That is to say, it is a class dynamic in the web of life. So, and I think Ruddiman, who is a total neo-Malthusian, was empirically absolutely correct. He wants to explain it in terms of rising population density, but that is a dependent variable. And it's a dependent variable, not just to agricultural productivity, but to the patterns of class formation, especially women's oppression, that occur under even these sort of Sumerian city-state formations. And there's a fantastic archaeological and anthropological literature on these questions. So class society is a carbonizing dynamic, which doesn't mean that's bad. I mean, carbon stabilized the Holocene and prevented a reversion to a new great ice age. However, there's always too much of a good thing, and quantity quality shifts ensue. So This is a very, very long history, and I'm going to, like I keep saying, that we're going to have these whirlwind tours. So I just want to I want you to forgive me and follow up with questions as they arise. This dynamic of climate class conjunctures goes back to the Bronze Age, so-called Bronze Age collapse. I don't like the word collapse. I think it was a crisis. However, you did see the dramatic reductions in the complexity of state organizations across the Eastern Mediterranean. You have the movements of sea peoples, still sort of murkily understood. But the movement of peoples into this area, you also had popular revolts. This is an illustration from the wonderful work of a French archaeologist, Kanusky, and his colleagues. I completely recommend it. The more popular version of this argument is Eric Klein, who is very useful and interesting. But I like Kanusky especially because he's really pinpointing these dynamics. So climate was a part of that story and a part of that transition towards simpler forms of social organization, which I don't think should be called collapse. I think they were a different form of social organization. And the fact is, the vast majority lived much better because the exploiting classes were dramatically weakened. And this is a recurrent phenomenon across the history of pre modern climate crises. Again, this annotation, we can look at the pre-modern and then early modern in the 17th century, which I mentioned, and again in the Age of Revolution, the Age of Malthus at the end of the 19th century. That was the last great cold snap of the Little Ice Age, which goes roughly from about the 1250s. That's when you have the onset of the, probably triggered by the eruption of Somulus, a volcano in present-day Indonesia, that then triggers shifts in the North Atlantic Oscillation. That's one of the key mechanisms of these climate class conjunctures in the early in these early climate class conjunctures before the onset of capitalism. And here I mentioned earlier the Roman climatic optimum. This is from the great archaeologist Carol Crumley, where she just illustrates, look, the favorable agroecological conditions through the climate were enormously favorable to Roman expansion. Indeed, Roman expansion in some sense follows the climate. The Romans are only able to vanquish the Celts once the climate changes. It's not, we can't reduce the explanation to that, but it's a key part of the story. Similarly, the crisis of the Roman West is linked up with the movement of peoples, the so-called migration period, and also with massive internal revolts, the Bagadai, for instance, in present-day Catalonia, and other peasant revolts across the 5th century, and as well as internal political discord and civil wars that ultimately lead to the crisis of Roman power in the West, its recentering in the East, and thereupon commenced a great golden age for the peasantry of that era. Let's remember that the peasantry had essentially been destroyed by Roman latifundias, and what we saw was the creation, not for the first time, but for the most recent time, of a village Europe. The villages had been basically wiped out on a large scale across Western Europe under Roman rule, and then peasants reorganized life and power and production around peasant priorities. So Dark Age, Golden Age, well, for whom? And that's crucial to keep in mind. These are just some pretty illustrations that show when the transition goes from the warm period to the Dark Ages, cold period. This one is the late antique Little Ice Age. You have favorable climate conditions for peasant power, with the thawing of the late antique Little Ice Age, really between 650 and 700, with the Merovingian agrarian renaissance. You have the reemergence of class society, which would, in twists and turns, eventually become feudalism. Historians hate that term, but I think it retains its utility for all sorts of good reasons. This is from the work of Ulf Bunken and his colleagues. So just as there was a crisis at the climate class conjuncture that coincides with the crisis of the Roman West, there was another climate class conjuncture that coincides with the crisis of feudalism. And this is crucial to make sense of. because the crisis of feudalism is usually represented in mainstream environmental circles as a demographic Malthusian dynamic. And for sure, there were population dynamics in play under the specific conditions of lord and peasant in late feudal or late high medieval, sometimes it's called, Europe. And this is still, I think, only weakly understood. I've been writing on this question for the past 20 years. It's absolutely fundamental. The climate crisis, the Black Death crisis, the induced crisis of peasant revolt in this period was very much a Marxist crisis and very much not a Malthusian crisis. And you can follow up on why I think that. But basically, long story short, Malthus took questions of nature outside of history, and Marx put questions of nature inside of history. And that's a big difference for the kinds of ways that we see history and for the possibilities we see ahead. So these are the most dramatic revolt, or most of the dramatic revolts of this era. What happened during the onset of the Little Ice Age in late medieval Europe was something very, very unusual in human history. The peasants won the class struggle. They basically defeated the seigneurs in the countryside and prevented a restoration of an older, more exploitive form of feudalism. Now, in time, the seigneurs and the bankers and the soldiers and the kings and the priests, they would all get their act together, certainly and emphatically after 1492, and reimpose a more brutal form of class exploitation in the countryside that we would call capitalism. However, in this moment, this is an image from the Grand Jacquerie of 1357-58 in France, of the peasants just taking it to the lord of, raising the estates, really shaking up feudal class structure at a moment when the climate conditions had detonated all of these long simmering contradictions within feudal society. And so you have these major climate class conjunctures. They're not the only ones, by the way. One could spend quite a long time, and I'm in the process of finishing a book on this question. On others, there were climate class conjunctures that were very, very favorable. So right around the year 1000, for instance, you have something called a feudal revolution. The comparator would be the Industrial Revolution in capitalism. That the feudal revolution, the birthing of a Castilian landscape, cathedrals, knights in shining armor, and all of that was very much, again, related to a favorable climate moment. That's a different kind of climate class conjuncture. And one of the ways that Europe's ruling strata, the priests and the soldiers and the bankers and everyone else, I've written a book on this with Raj Patel called A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. One of the ways that they dealt with the climate crisis was by conquering the Americas. And of course, that's a very crude summary, but there's a lot of truth to that. One of the things that did was it took a so-called normal virgin soil epidemic, to borrow Alfred Crosby's term, which would have killed 30%, give or take, of the population, still horrific, and turned that into an unimaginable genocide of about 95% of the population. You can see population decline on the right. This is the enormity of it is totally driven by labor recruitment, that is slaving strategies. And on the right, you see an illustration from Koch and Maslin and Lewis, a very fine article on the Great Dying, where they identify the hot spots of death, of genocide, and they map almost precisely onto the hot spots of commodity production and exchange, especially the sugar zones of northeastern Brazil, the silver mining complex of colonial Peru, and then the stock raising and silver mining and manufacturing centers of New Spain or Mexico. This had the effect of creating what I mentioned before, the Orbis spike, and it reinforced natural forcing to produce the coldest climate of the past 8,000 years in this long, cold 17th century. This is when capitalism, everything we know about capitalism pretty much forms. And just to remind you that, like all the others, this is a moment of profound popular revolts. This is from Jeff Parker's wonderful book called Global Crisis. But it's been well known by historians for a long time that the 17th century was an era of the general crisis. It was an era of popular revolt, of elites going to war with each other, of economic volatility, et cetera, et cetera. So this was a real crisis. Indeed, a similar set of climatic conditions had been involved in the epochal crisis of feudalism. This dynamic set in motion not only an audacious climate fix strategy of moving to the frontiers and the colonies, but part of that because, the new capitalist empires killed all the indigenous peoples. They went and invented transatlantic slavery. Slavery had been around in many modes of production, but takes on a very, very brutal form under capitalism. And no, it's not about race. Race comes later. Race is invented ex post facto. This was also a dynamic of what I call climate patriarchy, of to create a gendered surplus profit dynamic within Western Europe. The work of Silvia Federici, if you're curious, is indispensable on this. While medieval Europe was no feminist paradise, women were incomparably better. Peasant women were incomparably better off in the 14th century than they were in the 17th century. And if you want just a feel for the ideology of the time, you can go back and take a look at Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew, where woman becomes part of nature and is wild and unruly and in need of discipline. This comes up in many different areas of politics in this time. And so the formation of the great European empires was very much the outcome of a climate forcing dynamic to fix these dynamics, to fix the real problems of the era. And it sets the stage for the plantation revolutions, first in sugar and then decisively in cotton. It is these revolutions that make the so-called industrial revolution possible based on coal and steam power. And by the way, coal and steam power were not used primarily for industry. Yes, in textile manufacturing, that's true, but only after the year 1830 on a large scale. And the major use of it was to build railways and steamships so that European armies could go all around the world and conquer the rest of the planet, which is exactly what they did. And that's one of many reasons why we need to understand imperialism and militarized accumulation as a key driver of climate, biodiversity, and other crises. So some takeaways here, and I'm just going to sort of conclude here over the next 3, 4, 5 minutes so that we have lots of time for conversation. First of all, these climate class conjunctures were, in biophysical, geophysical terms, extremely serious. However, their specific impact flowed through the mediations of class structures, understood not as well there's a class structure here and a political structure here, but politics, culture, economy, etc., are really mediations or expressions of an underlying class structure. Again, to simplify ridiculously, lord and peasant under feudalism, bourgeois and proletarian under capitalism. Is it more complex? Lord, yes, it's more complex. And I'll tease that out for those who have questions. Just to give you the last snapshot, the Age of Revolutions, the so-called Industrial Revolution, is itself occasioned by a climate class conjuncture that seems to have been sparked by the eruption of the Laki fissure, L-A-K-I, in Iceland in 1783. It was absolutely devastating, and it's intimately connected with popular revolt in Ireland, in the French Revolution. The English countryside is essentially ungovernable. It has a significant impact on agricultural productivity, which had stalled out in England even before the Laki fissure eruption. But this was another climate class conjuncture. This is Shays' Rebellion in the United States as well. And this is where we get Malthus, who is very much a little Ice Age thinker. And everything that he's saying about climate, or rather everything he's saying about population, about which he knew practically nothing, by the way, everything he says is really a kind of mediation of this climate class conjuncture. Malthus was a slavish bootlicker of the imperialists. He was the first chair, I should say, of political economy at the East India Company's college, and he trained administrators and future teachers at the college who were involved in some of the most horrific crimes of the 19th century, the late Victorian Holocaust in India, starting in the late 19th century, and of course before that the Irish famine, which was totally a product of British Empire. Meanwhile, there was a climate fix, a movement onto new frontiers. This is the cotton frontier, the cotton plantation revolution. It means, for instance, that the key machine of this era is not the steam engine. It's emphatically not the steam engine. It is the steam engine becomes important, really decisive, much later, really after the 1860s. It's the cotton gin, which radically increased the productivity of labor and provided the economic basis, the profitability conditions for the second great wave of slavery, and also for textile industrialization in Britain. This is very important to start to make sense of and to move beyond Malthus at Nature's Mighty Feast. Pogo would have been right at home. You know, it's we all have to be virtuous. It's all of us. We're all responsible. All right, so let's wrap this up so we have lots and lots of time. I know that I'm right on the edge here. And we're going to conclude with this. From really the early 1970s, when the trilateralists and people like Richard Gardner and Maurice Strong and others who organized Stockholm 72 with oil company money, by the way, their project all along was to create a structure of planetary management that would not admit democracy into the process. This is a contentious point, I admit, but I've increasingly drawn this conclusion over the past 3 years of research that Stockholm 72 and cognate events were on an international stage around environmentalism were specifically to limit and to contain the third world revolt. That's a lot to throw at you, but that's very much with us today. That's why if you go anywhere in the global south, people will identify the problem as northern-based NGOs and identify the climate politics that are emerging in the North Atlantic as the politics of climate austerity. And by the way, I can't speak for other working classes at this moment, but the American working class certainly feels that same way. So what does this shift allow us to do? It allows us to step outside of the prison house of man versus nature, which is a dead end. There's nothing you can do about it except to manage the problem, which is, if you look at it more closely, essentially a 21st century or late 20th century retrofit of an old civilizing project, which said basically all of you savages are too stupid, irrational, whatever, to really know how to behave. So we're going to manage you through colonialism and the civilizing project and all of that. Let's keep that in mind because it's very important. The other is that these moments of unfavorable climate change are moments of political possibility. And indeed, we see this across the world, that even though what happened starting in the mid-1970s in the Imperial West was the decapitation of the socialist left and the labor-led left almost everywhere, with the profound connivance of the security forces, the security state in the North Atlantic for its internal opposition, and then a brutal, long-running process of shock doctrines and forever wars across the global South ever since. This has taken different forms, but everybody talks about, Oxfam gives us these wonderful charts of income and wealth inequality and responsibility for climate, but they don't want to say the really dangerous thing, which is that this is the product of imperialism, and it's quite crucial. Now, some of you might be thinking, really, this is an era of profound popular revolt from below? Yes, it is. However, because the left was decapitated, the politics are totally chaotic. And this is really demonstrated by the work of Andrei Korotayev and his colleagues. This is one illustration from this in the aftermath of the Great Recession, that we see this extraordinary wave of what they call anti-government protests, which is everything from acts of terrorism, blowing up pipelines, to occupying town squares, labor strikes. It's a very motley index, and it can be parsed and critiqued for sure. But there's no question that the level of ferment has been building spectacularly over the past decade. So what are our lessons? Claude already introduced them, but I'll just repeat them. First, adverse climates, unfavorable climates tend to favor movements towards a great leveling of class society, towards more egalitarianism. This is so because climate is not, it's not climate determinism. Climate intensifies socio-ecological contradictions. It is a contradiction multiplier. It supercharges all the problems. And I think we see this very clearly everywhere. Uh, and then finally, that supercharging derives ultimately the fundamental pressure at the level of the civilization or mode of production comes from the ways that climate crises suppress agricultural productivity and therefore squeeze surplus labor. So what did the most powerful try to do? They try to squeeze even more surplus labor to compensate for what's been lost. And if you look at places like the United States and other places around the world, but especially the United States, the working class hasn't had a pay raise for a half century. So that's so the ruling class has taken all of the surplus labor. It's not like it was in the golden age where, okay, you know, still the bosses took most of the productivity gains, but there were real and significant improvements in the well-being for the working class majority. That's no longer happening. It hasn't been happening for a long time. So this is an intellectual, but also clearly political movement. And I think we need to be aware of the ongoing movements away from capitalism. Looks different in Washington, looks different in Beijing. Washington is forever wars and build up the deep state and the security services and threaten, you know, more saber rattling. Beijing is Belt and Road. And I'm not going to romanticize that, but it's clearly much less warlike and much more egalitarian. And that means that whatever happens, it's going to be a moment of crisis and political possibility. Thank you very much.
Well, that is really a jam-packed 50 minutes or so. I normally, as host, have the prerogative of being the